They dammed one of Africa's wildest rivers and trapped the largest reservoir on the planet behind a single wall of concrete. Then the water turned on it. In 2024, that reservoir nearly vanished. 8% was all that was left, and 2 countries went dark. At the same time, from the other side, the river was carving away the dam's own foundation. For 60 years, this wall worked. It tamed the Zambezi and powered 2 nations, and that is exactly why it is now failing in 2 directions at once. Join beyond the limits as we follow one dam, caught between too much water and too little, and the millions downstream who have no way back.
Before this wall, the Zambezi flooded whole valleys, then vanished to a trickle. 6 years ago, engineers decided to end that.
To understand the trap, start with what the wall solved. The Zambezi is one of Africa's great rivers, and before the dam, it ran wild, flooding in the wet season and shrinking to a trickle in the dry. In 1955, engineers began pouring a double-curvature concrete arch across the Kariba Gorge, a wall 128 meters tall, shaped to turn the river's force back into the rock on either side. By 1959, the gorge was sealed and the valley behind it began to fill. It kept filling for years, until the water reached 280 kilometers upstream, Lake Kariba. For the people of the valley, the lake was an eviction. Around 57,000 Tongans were moved off their ancestral land as the water rose, resettled on poorer ground with promises that mostly went unkept. As the lake climbed, game rangers raced to lift stranded animals off the shrinking islands, more than 6,000 of them in a rescue they called Operation Noah. The Tonga had its own warning. Their river god, Nyaminyami, a serpent with the head of a fish, was said to live in the gorge, and they believed he would never allow the river to be held. During construction, floods killed dozens of workers. The Tonga said it was the god fighting back. The dam endured anyway, and what it produced reorganized 2 economies. The power stations built into its flanks generate just over 1,000 megawatts each, and that hydropower supplies more than 75% of Zambia's electricity and the single largest share of Zimbabwe's. 2 countries, plugged into one wall. That was the achievement. It was also the exposure. A dam on a river this size must do 2 opposite jobs. It must hold water back. And when there is too much, it has to let water out, fast, without that water tearing the dam apart on the way down. Kariba releases it through spillway gates near the top of the wall. The water falls more than 100 meters and slams into the rock at the base of the gorge. For decades, that falling water has been carving a hole. Engineers call it the plunge-pool. By the 2000s, it had been gouged roughly 90 meters deep, a crater chewed into the bedrock directly below the dam. And it was moving. Each flood season, the scour crept backward toward the foundations on which the entire wall rests on. In 2015, the warning went public. Engineering assessments concluded that if the erosion kept advancing, it could undermine the dam's footing, and in the worst case, the wall could fail. The structure built to control the river was being taken apart by the river it released. And it was happening because the dam was doing what it was designed to do. That is the first edge of the trap. Letting the water out is destroying the dam from below. The second edge is the opposite problem. What happens when the water stops coming at all?
Letting the water out is destroying the dam. But what happens when the water stops coming at all?
Between 2023 and 2025, an El Niño drought settled over southern Africa, and the rain that feeds the Zambezi did not arrive. A reservoir is only an asset when it is full. Lake Kariba began to drop. The boat ramps lengthened. Pale rings appeared on the shoreline. And the number the 2 countries watched most closely, usable storage, the water high enough to drive the turbines, fell away. On August 26, 2024, Lake Kariba held about 8% of its usable water. The largest reservoir ever built was nearly empty. The power went with it. Kariba South, rated above 1,000 megawatts, was throttled down to around 250. In Zambia, where the dam carries most of the grid, blackouts stretched to 17 hours a day, and by some accounts, 21. Factories ran on diesel or stopped. Hospitals rationed power. A drought 1,000 kilometers upstream became a dark kitchen in Lusaka. This is the cost of plugging two countries into one wall. When the wall works, it carries everything. When the river behind it fails, everything fails together because there is no second river to switch to. And while the lake sat nearly empty, the other clock kept running. Because the day the rains return in force, the gates have to open again, and the water has to fall once more into the hole beneath the dam.
So what happens if this wall actually gives way? Engineers have already run the numbers.
So, what happens if the foundation gives way? This is the scenario engineers modeled, and it is the reason the warnings were not quiet. If the Kariba Wall failed, it would send a flood wave down the Zambezi, far beyond anything the river produces naturally. That wave would reach the next great dam downstream, Cahora Bassa in Mozambique, in roughly 8 hours. Cahora Bassa was not built to absorb a wall of water that size. It could go two. Together, those two dams account for a large share of southern Africa's hydroelectric power. Losing both would be a continent-scale blow to the grid, delivered in a single afternoon. And it would not only be about electricity. Estimates put as many as 3.5 million people in the path downstream, across Mozambique and Malawi. The wall that shields them from the river is the same wall whose failure would drown them. That is why a crater at the base of a 60-year-old dam became an international emergency. The thing holding the river back had begun to come apart, and everyone downstream was already living inside the consequence. The repair began in 2017, the Kariba Dam Rehabilitation Project, a roughly $294 million effort funded by the World Bank, the European Union, the African Development Bank, Sweden, and the two governments through the Zambezi River Authority. It did two things. It reshaped the plunge-pool, carving the crater into a controlled form so the falling water stops cutting backward toward the foundation. And it rebuilt the spillway gates, which had seized and corroded after decades of use. By 2025, the most urgent piece, the plunge-pool reshaping, was reported complete. The crater that had been migrating toward the dam's footing has, for now, been stabilized. But look at what the fix leaves untouched. It gives the river nowhere else to go and does nothing to make the two countries any less dependent on one wall across one gorge. It buys time. It keeps the structure standing so the same arrangement can continue. Right now, the lake is rising again. In June 2026, Lake Kariba reached about 47% of its usable storage, the healthiest level since 2019, after 2 good rainy seasons. The turbines are spinning back up, and the blackouts are easing. But nothing about the trap has changed. The dam still moves between two failures. It cannot escape. Too little water, and the grid goes dark. Too much, and the spillway goes back to work on its own foundation. The rehabilitation bought time against one of them. The drought showed there is no comparable fix for the other. 60 years ago, the Tonga said the river would never accept the wall. They meant it as a warning about a god. It reads now as a warning about engineering. This pattern is bigger than Kariba. The Hoover Dam made the modern American Southwest possible, and Lake Mead behind it now sits at historic lows. The Aswan High Dam gave Egypt control of the Nile, and the Nile Delta is eroding into the sea because of it. Each is the same bargain, a single structure that turns a wild river into a dependency, dependable right up until the river does something the structure cannot hold. Every dam built to power a nation makes the same quiet trade. Certainty now, total dependence later. Kariba is just the one where the bill has arrived, from both directions at once. And the cost is paid downstream by the people who can no longer choose to live without the wall. If this held your attention, give it a like. It helps it reach the next person who would want to see it. For more on what happens when we re-engineer the rivers we depend on, watch our video on the Three Gorges Dam, the largest power station on Earth, and what it sets moving downstream. And to see a coastline built out of the open sea and what it costs the water around it, watch Dubai's Palm Islands. Subscribe, and we will keep taking the world's biggest structures apart to show you what holds them up and what they cost.